Hello and welcome to my channel. In this one I'm going to do a drawing of this large old tree on a hill. I'm going to use colored pencils on sandpaper. I used a slightly different brand of sandpaper this time. It gave me a little bit of trouble, but it wasn't too bad. Let's have a look. So I started by sketching out the general shape of the tree. So let me say a few words about the materials. I am using Faber Castell Polychromos colored pencils. They work pretty well on this surface. And the surface is a 1000 grit sandpaper. And I've already used sandpaper, like regular fine sandpaper, for colored pencil drawings. But this time I used a slightly different brand. Now this one, I like this one because of the background color, the color of the paper, which is very good for landscapes and things like that. This kind of a reddish sand color maybe. But it performed a little bit different than some of the sandpapers that I used so far. It produced a lot of residue. I don't know if you can tell. I think you can already see that as I'm trying to draw the sky here. It's producing a lot of residue, and the problem was that there wasn't really anything I could do with that residue, because you can't really push it in with any method of blending, either with your finger or with some blending tools. And you just have to blow the residue off. And the way to fill in the tooth, because obviously a lot of these smaller yellowish spaces will be seen through when you don't cover everything with your colored pencil. The way to cover it thoroughly is just to use more pressure. I honestly couldn't find a different way other than just push against the paper harder, and that really burns through your pencils a lot faster. So that's one of the disadvantages of this paper that I found immediately in the first few minutes of starting to work on it. Like I said, I do like the color. It is a 1000 grit sandpaper. It does allow you to layer colored pencils, like layer lighter pencils on top of the darker ones, which we will see a little bit later. But when it comes to covering these large areas, I had a huge amount of problems, and that's why this was kind of a slow drawing process. This tree, even though it's not a very complex scene, took several hours to do. And you can see as I'm trying to do this sky, I'm producing a ton of residue, and when I try to blend it with my finger, I'm just not going anywhere because it's not pushing it into those lighter spaces, and I just have to go over it again with a pencil and just use more pressure. So that's what I eventually ended up doing. Anyway, after I sketched out the shape of the base of the tree and the shape of the tree trunk and some of the larger boughs, I started working on the canopy. And my approach when drawing foliage, when drawing trees, is pretty much always the same in colored pencil. I usually use a combination of maybe 2 or 3 different pencils. I use a gray for like a base. I use a green, sorry, for the base tone, and this time I'm going to use a darker green. This, I believe, is chromium oxide green. And then on top of that, I'm going to use a black colored pencil for some of the shadow areas and to add a little bit of texture in between. Because when you look at foliage at a distance, it kind of looks like a bunch of smaller, darker and lighter shapes bunched together. And when you just pull your darker pencil on top of the slightly lighter green pencil, you produce a lot of these random shapes. You produce that random texture that's a combination of tiny green and dark, almost black shapes. And that allows you to imitate that texture. Now, another thing that I can do here is I can go back in with this light blue and punch some holes in the canopy, creating an illusion like obviously you can see the sky through the canopy, through the foliage and the branches, because it's not completely opaque. It doesn't obscure all of the background color, all of the sky. So for the sky I used a sky blue, which is like a cooler light blue pencil, and for the foliage I used this darker green, the chromium oxide green, and then a black colored pencil on top. As usual, I used two black colored pencils. I used the Faber Castell Polychromos black colored pencil, but I also used the Kohinoor silky black pencil, which is a little bit darker, and when I put it on top of other layers it's even darker than the Polychromos black pencil. That's why I like to use both. So as you can see, I'm making some progress with the foliage here, but all along the way I kept dealing with unusual and somewhat frustrating properties of this paper, because when I put in my marks with a colored pencil, it doesn't really stick to the surface of the paper quite as well as with some other papers. This is very good quality sandpaper, I have to say, because it's almost impossible to burnish the surface. It really takes a lot of it can take a lot of abuse, but Duragold, I believe, is the brand. So it's really high quality sandpaper, but for drawing, I don't know, I just liked some of the other smear decks and Klingspor, or whatever the name was. Some of the other ones are a little bit better because they seem to interact with my colored pencils a bit better. With this one, I just found it a little bit slower to work with, and it was more difficult to blend. And I could layer, I was able to layer, I was able to put lighter details on top of the darker ones. But another frustrating thing that I found was that often when I tried to use one layer on top of the other one, I found that the pencil would dig the pigment out of the tooth of the paper and simply reveal the background color of the paper, which is not what I wanted. I wanted to put layer upon layer, which the paper sometimes did allow me to do, but I ended up using a lot more pressure than I wanted, because that seemed to be the only thing that was actually working, just pushing a little bit harder against the surface of the paper. And like I said, the paper is really durable and it's really difficult to destroy that tooth. So, you know, I was able to fix all of the mistakes, and I was able to get it to look like to look as I wanted it, but it just that it was a lot slower to get there. The process was a lot slower. I believe that if I did this in pastel pencils or soft pastels, it would be a lot easier and a lot faster than with colored pencils. But I do prefer colored pencils most of the time, so I decided to use them here. Now let me talk a little bit more about this scene, because I talked a little bit too much about the materials and maybe neglected some parts of the drawing process. So the composition is simple. We just have that tree in the middle, just a large old tree on a hill. There's also going to be a swing, and this large canopy is going to be creating a lot of shade under the tree. So it's a very nice countryside scene with a few hills and mountains in the background. Nothing too complicated. The only thing that's really complicated is this tree, its canopy, and of course the fact that the surface of this sandpaper made things a little bit more difficult for me than I expected. Now I'm drawing some of the smaller branches, trying to further define some of these smaller shapes within this larger shape. And some of those branches will end up being visible. Others will be maybe obscured by the canopy, by all the foliage. I don't really know that at this point of the drawing process, but you know, it's just something that I like to work out as I go along. but regardless of whether these branches will end up being visible or not, I try to draw their shapes so that they look realistic, or as realistic as I can make them. So I draw these gnarly shapes that grow every which way and that taper as they grow out, and they branch out as they grow out. So as long as you try to create shapes that kind of look like that, they will end up looking like branches. And you can see that for most of them I used a black colored pencil. I will use some lighter pencils on top of that a little bit later, but mostly a black colored pencil because I need them to be mostly dark, because they're mostly in the shadow, and the lower part of the canopy is also going to be in the shadow, so that's going to be a lot darker, almost black, but not exactly quite black, but really, really dark green, because I plan to combine dark green and black to get a really dark, deep green color. The reason why that works on this surface is because sandpaper allows you to do things with a colored pencil that you can't really do on regular paper. It allows you to blend colored pencils for real, because on regular paper you can just sort of layer them, creating an illusion like you've blended the colors, but you can't really blend them. You can only do that with pastels and pastel pencils, but on sandpaper, because this rough surface grinds down on the pencil and moves that pigment easier, you're actually able to mix colors, even though that sounds almost impossible when working on regular paper. You can see that I'm kind of going back and forth when I'm drawing this foliage, because sometimes I put in some of the darker values first, the darker foliage first, then I put in a little bit of a lighter green. Sometimes I start with a green first, and then I go back and go over that with some black. Sometimes I use the green on top of the black to make the black a little bit more green and a little bit lighter, and also to make it a bit smoother by removing some of those spaces where the background color of the paper is breaking through. And sometimes, or occasionally, I go back in with a blue colored pencil, adding those smaller dots and smaller shapes to make it look like some of the sky is visible through the branches and through the foliage. So as you can see, the shape of the canopy is coming along nicely as I'm trying to break it into smaller shapes, lots of smaller segments that form around the larger boughs, larger parts of the tree trunk. As for the reference, it's going to be in the description if you want to check it out. And obviously, as always, when I draw landscapes, I don't really stick to the exact appearance of the terrain or the tree. I just go with the general shapes, the general ideas. Sometimes it's a little bit closer to what you can see in the reference. Sometimes it's quite a bit different. Here I think it will be pretty close, but if I don't get the shape of the canopy or the branches to look exactly the same, to be honest, that was never really my intention, because I don't really care about that. I like the general shape of the tree, and I'm going to make it look sort of like it. And you can also notice that I use a lighter green on top of this darker green to add some lighter details. Again, this is something that you can only do on sandpaper. By the way, if you can afford, or if you can find higher quality sanded papers like Pastelmat or UArt, I highly recommend that you use those. But if you can't get those, or if you find them too expensive, that's fine. You can just use regular sandpaper that you can buy in your hardware store. Just use a finer grit. For colored pencils, 800 to 1000 grit works best in my experience. For pastels, 600 to 800 maybe. And it's a wonderful surface for working with both colored pencils and pastel pencils. It's very durable, and it's almost as good as regular artist quality, expensive artist quality pastel paper or sanded paper. Anyway, as you can see, I'm also doing a little bit more work on the background as well. I did a bit more of the sky behind the tree, and I'm starting to define some of these hills or slopes behind the tree. And in order to break the monotony of those yellowish surfaces, I'm also introducing some duller tones and occasionally a little bit of green to indicate like maybe there are some bushes and some smaller clusters of trees on those hills and slopes behind the tree. Here I also have some mountains in the distance. These are a bit more bluish because they're much further away in the distance. And then above that I'm drawing a little bit more of the sky, trying to define that line of the horizon because I need to have a very clean edge between the hills and the background and the sky. And another thing that I forgot to mention, and you may have noticed it, was that at the very bottom of that sky, just above the horizon, I used a little bit of lighter color, even lighter than the sky blue color. I used a light cool gray to make that part of the sky a bit lighter. So I wanted to have a bit of a gradient where the sky gets a bit lighter near the horizon. Anyway, I'm filling in the rest of the canopy here using the dark green pencil that I used since the beginning. And I'm just going to fill this in with this dark green pencil, and then I'm going to work on that, on top of that, with a black colored pencil, creating a bit of texture, creating something that looks like foliage, and then breaking those shapes into smaller shapes, like these tiny groups of trees, and basically making the canopy appear both more complex but also more three-dimensional, because this is not entirely random. As you can see, I'm trying to stay consistent with my light source, which is coming from above, but it's also coming a little bit more from the right. So I'm going to keep those surfaces which are facing down and facing to the left a little bit darker. And again, on top of these dark green areas here and there, I'm adding a little bit of lighter green just to make the some of those lighter leaves really pop out, and to make the canopy appear even more three-dimensional, because when you have that range of value, that gives you a feeling of shape and depth, and it makes everything look more three-dimensional. But there's a lot of work to be done here, as you can see on the canopy. The canopy itself is the most complex part, and I've spent, well, almost 2 hours fidgeting with it, just trying to define all of these smaller shapes and textures, just to get it to look as realistic as possible, but also trying to adapt to the properties of this paper, which, like I said, performed a bit different than some of the papers I used before. I could also have used regular paper primed with clear gesso for this one. I think that would work pretty well. But, you know, sometimes I just like to switch back to sandpaper because that's probably my favorite surface when it comes to working with colored pencils. Here I'm using, again, that lighter green for some of the lighter portions of the canopy. I'm using the May green, I think. And I'm just using it very sparingly on top of some of these segments. And whenever I add a few touches with a lighter pencil, that gives the illusion to the viewer like that leaf or that cluster of leaves is sticking out from the canopy and is catching more light from the light source, which makes it lighter than the rest of those darker greenish shapes. So as you can see, the canopy is largely done. I'm making my way down to the bottom of the canopy and the tree trunk. And here I'm also adding some variation on the tree trunk, making some parts of the tree trunk a little bit lighter so that it looks like some parts of that tree trunk are exposed to the light source and others are in the shadow. As for the foreground here, it's going to be a grassy hill, and I'm going to want some slightly warmer and more yellowish tones here, which is why I'm using this yellow colored pencil. I'm going to use that just to modify the background color ever so slightly, and then I'm going to go in and define some of the details, like add grass and clumps of grass and a little bit of variation in the terrain and things like that. For some of those lighter blades of grass, I'm going to use a duller and lighter pencil, like this light beige pencil. And for some of the darker details, like the shadow areas between the clumps of grass, I'm going to use burnt sienna and maybe a walnut brown and some others. For the shadow under the tree, I used a combination of black and brown. And I think the shadow already looks pretty convincing. Like I said, the shadow appears to be cast a little bit more to the left, which means that the light source is not just above, it's a little bit more to the right. So I'm going to stay consistent with that, with the canopy as well as the tree trunk. And as you can see here, I'm adding some more lighter details on this grassy terrain in the foreground, trying to make the foreground a bit more interesting and a bit more complex looking before I move on to the right side of the canopy and finish the rest of that. I added a lot of these branches to the right, and some of them are kind of bare, meaning that they are not entirely covered with foliage, or that they're not entirely obscured with foliage. I kind of wanted that way, just a little bit of asymmetry in the shape of the tree that makes it look more organic, more natural. And I'm just adding some finishing details on the canopy. I probably should have mentioned this at the very beginning of the video, but if you haven't subscribed, you should really consider subscribing to my channel, because that will make it more likely for you to see some of my future uploads. Also, don't forget to give me a like and comment, because you know, the YouTube algorithm is not very nice or not very friendly to artists, and you know, YouTube seems to push all kinds of crappy content onto us viewers, and if you want to see some nicer things, not necessarily just my artwork but other artists as well, do subscribe to my and to their channels and give them a like, and that way the algorithm will keep recommending this type of content to you instead of just random retarded stuff that it usually does. Anyway, I'm adding a little bit of green to this slope here on the right, and a bit of black on top of that as well to add a bit of variation. I'm just trying to make this look like a wooded part of the slope where there are some bushes and trees on that part of the terrain. And a bit of brown as well, just to make that hill a little bit darker at the bottom so that it stands out against the foreground area maybe. And I also need to add a few more details to this grassy area to the right as well. But I'm largely done with the tree. I just need to do the rest of the background. Again, I'm using the same combination of pencils, just adding a few lighter touches with this light beige colored pencil on top of some brownish and reddish tones. So this grassy area in the foreground is a little bit more yellowish. I'm also going to add a little bit of shadow on the other side as well, maybe a few branches here and there, and also maybe a few greenish details in the foreground as well, like maybe there are some bushes or some greenish clumps of grass on this grassy area in the foreground as well. And now I'm going to draw the swing, and it's just going to be a small shape here in the shade of the tree under one of these larger boughs. Also need to draw the ropes here, and I hope that I can keep them relatively straight. Just a few finishing touches on the tree, a few branches here and there, a few shadow areas, and it's pretty much done. As for the signature, I'm going to put it here in the lower left corner, and now the drawing is done. I hope you like it. Took a little bit longer than I expected, but I'm pretty happy with the way it came out. If you want to see longer videos and more content, check out my Patreon. Anyway, I'm going to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching and bye for now.